My boss called me the network's diversity hire and laughed when I said the love interest might be black. When I tried to explain why, he patted my head and said, "Sweet that you think this was about racism." I stayed silent. That was 1 month ago. Yesterday, he dropped his coffee mug and didn't say a word for the rest of the meeting. No one in the TV writer's room thought I could possibly understand the book we were adapting. They didn't know I wrote it. When I found out the dystopian novel I wrote under a pen name at 24 was going to be a TV show, I thought it was the best news of my life. But then the network head told me something even better. He wanted me to join the writer's room to help create the show. He said they needed fresh perspectives and my background would bring valuable insights. He never mentioned to the other writers that I was actually the author, and I figured I'd let my work speak for itself rather than walking in announcing my identity. The showrunner welcomed me on my first day with barely concealed annoyance. "So you're the network's diversity hire," he said. The other 5 writers, all men over 40, sized me up like I'd stolen something from them. "I'm looking forward to working with everyone," I said, settling into my seat. "I have some thoughts about the Underground Railroad themes that could translate powerfully." "Thoughts?" interrupted the head writer. "That's adorable. I've been analyzing literature since before you were born. This book requires maturity to grasp. The network forced you on us, but that doesn't mean you understand the material." The showrunner pulled up his presentation. "The author is clearly writing from middle-aged disillusionment. The protagonist is obviously the author himself, a brilliant man trapped by society's expectations. I interpreted the protagonist as a stand-in for," I started, knowing exactly what I'd intended when writing him. "That's exactly the surface-level interpretation I expected from a diversity hire. This is prestige television. Just because the network forced you on us doesn't mean we use your ideas." I thought about correcting them then, but their naked hostility made me swallow the words. Maybe if I earned their respect first, the revelation would go smoother. Over the next weeks, every idea I pitched got shot down with increasing condescension. When I suggested the love interest should be black like I'd written her, the showrunner laughed so hard he spilled coffee. "Where'd you get that idea? Because she has curly hair? The author describes her as golden in the lamplight. Obviously she's white. This is why networks shouldn't interfere with creative teams." I said, "But chapter 12 mentions her dealing with assumptions based on appearance," and he cut me off. "You're reading too much into it because you want to see yourself in everything. Stop forcing diversity where it doesn't exist." When I pitched exploring the Underground Railroad imagery I'd carefully woven throughout, the head writer actually patted my head. "Sweet that you think this was about racism. The tunnels are clearly metaphors for the internet. You'd understand if you'd studied real literature instead of whatever quotas got you here." When I said, "There are Frederick Douglass quotes embedded," he interrupted me with, "Anyone can find coincidences. This author is too sophisticated for your obvious parallels. The network may force us to have you here, but we don't have to pretend your ideas have merit." During character discussions, they'd constantly correct my interpretations of my own work. When I explained Sarah's anger came from generational trauma, the showrunner rolled his eyes dramatically. "Not everything is trauma and identity politics. What is it with you people and bringing race into everything? The author understands human nature a lot better than you do." One day I heard them talking about me at the water cooler, saying how stupid I was for not understanding that white male characters were universal, and I was being desperate by wanting to see people who wanted to look like me on the screen. "People like her make everything about what color they are," my boss said with an eye roll. "They're the real racists." Week after week, they explained my metaphors incorrectly, told me I was everything wrong with forced diversity in writers' rooms, and made jokes about babysitting me. "You probably think the author is a woman," someone laughed, "or black. Just because they understand oppression doesn't mean they're not a white man, you know. You just want to demonize white people." I didn't say that, I said carefully. All I said was the author could be anyone, even a young black woman. "A young black woman?" They erupted laughing. "Writing this level of prose? The network really found someone delusional. I thought she was just here for racial diversity," my boss said. "But maybe she's our psychotic representation as well." But that moment, right when I was at my breaking point, the studio head walked in beaming. Everyone jumped up, straightening their clothes and trying to look impressive. He said, "Sorry to barge in. Wanted to check how the author of our book is settling in." When she agreed to join personally, I couldn't believe our luck. He looked straight at me. "Hope these gentlemen have been receptive to your vision for your own book. How has your first month been?" My boss dropped his coffee mug. The silence was deafening as 6 men who'd spent 4 weeks insulting me realized who I was, and that the next words out of my mouth could end their careers forever. I took a deep breath, feeling every eye in the room boring into me. The showrunner's face had gone from smug superiority to ashen shock. The head writer still had his hand frozen in midair from where he'd been gesturing dismissively moments before. The studio head beamed at me expectantly, completely unaware of the tension crackling through the room. I stood slowly, smoothing down my shirt, and gave him the brightest smile I could manage. I told him it had been an educational experience, watching how the team interpreted my work. The showrunner's coffee mug finally hit the floor, shattering ceramic across the pristine writer's room carpet. Brown liquid spread in an expanding puddle that no one moved to clean. The studio head's eyebrows rose slightly at the mess, but I continued speaking calmly about how fascinating it was to see my themes discussed from such unique perspectives. I emphasized the word unique just enough to make the head writer flinch. The showrunner finally found his voice, though it came out strangled. He stammered something about not realizing, about the network keeping secrets, about how they would have treated me differently if they'd known. His hands shook as he bent to pick up the larger pieces of his mug. I watched him struggle with the ceramic shards, noting how his fingers trembled. The other writers remained frozen in their seats, their faces cycling through various shades of panic. One of them, the one who'd called me psychotic representation, had gone so pale I worried he might faint. The studio head looked between us, his smile faltering as he finally registered the atmosphere. He asked if everything was all right, if there had been some misunderstanding. His tone suggested he was beginning to piece together exactly what kind of reception I'd received. I assured him we were just surprised by the sudden visit, then turned to my colleagues. I suggested we should probably clean up the coffee before it stained the carpet. The practical suggestion seemed to break their paralysis, and suddenly everyone was moving at once, grabbing paper towels and stammering apologies. The showrunner kept repeating that he had no idea, that if someone had just told him that this was all a terrible miscommunication. His words tumbled over each other as he dabbed frantically at the coffee stain, which only seemed to spread wider with his efforts. I knelt beside him with my own paper towels, working methodically at the edges of the spill. Our hands nearly touched as we cleaned, and he jerked back as if I'd burned him. The head writer hovered hovered nearby, opening and closing his mouth like a fish gasping for air. The studio head watched this performance with increasing concern. He mentioned that he'd specifically asked the network head to keep my identity quiet initially, to let me get a feel for the room without any preconceptions. His tone suggested he was reconsidering the wisdom of that decision. I stood, depositing the soaked paper towels in the trash, and told him it had definitely given me an authentic perspective on the creative process. The showrunner made a choking sound that might have been either a laugh or a sob. One of the other writers, the one who'd insisted my protagonist was obviously a middle-aged white man, finally spoke up. He said something about how they'd been analyzing the text academically, how they hadn't meant anything personal. His voice cracked on the word personal. I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his words. Then I mentioned how interesting it was that they'd found so many interpretations I'd never considered when writing it, like the tunnels being metaphors for the internet instead of the Underground Railroad imagery I'd researched for months. The head writer's face flushed deep red. He started to explain that literary criticism was subjective, that authors didn't always understand their own subconscious meanings. Then he seemed to remember who he was talking to, and trailed off mid-sentence. The studio head's expression had shifted from concern to something harder. He asked if I'd been sharing my thoughts on the adaptation, if the team had been receptive to my input. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. I chose my words carefully, saying that everyone had been very clear about their vision for the show. The showrunner's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as I spoke. I added that I'd learned a lot about how different people could read the same text. The studio head's jaw tightened. He turned to the showrunner and asked directly if they'd been utilizing my expertise, if they'd been respectful of my contributions. The question hung in the air like a blade. How did they all work in the same room for weeks without figuring out who she really was? The way the coffee mug shattered when the truth came out makes me wonder if the showrunner's whole worldview just broke too. The showrunner's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he managed to say that perhaps there had been some creative differences, some miscommunication about roles and expectations. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning. I watched him squirm, remembering every dismissive comment, every patronizing explanation of my own work. Part of me wanted to list every insult, every moment they'd made me feel small and stupid, but I held my tongue, letting the silence stretch. The studio head's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then announced he had to take this call but would be back. He looked directly at me and said we'd be having a longer conversation very soon about the show's direction. Then he left, closing the door with a decisive click. The moment he was gone, the room erupted. Everyone started talking at once, voices overlapping in a chaos of excuses and explanations. The showrunner stepped toward me, his hands spread in what he probably thought was a placating gesture. He said we needed to discuss this like professionals, that surely I understood they hadn't meant any harm. His voice had taken on a wheedling quality that made my skin crawl. The same voice that had called me a diversity hire now dripped with false sincerity. I remained silent, watching them scramble. The head writer tried a different approach, saying that actually, now that he thought about it, he could see how the Underground Railroad imagery worked. His about face was so abrupt it would have been funny if I hadn't been so angry. Another writer chimed in that they'd always thought the love interest might be black, that he'd been meaning to bring it up. This from the man who'd laughed at the very suggestion just days ago. Their desperate revisionism was almost pathetic. The showrunner's assistant knocked and entered, reminding him about a scheduled call with the network. His face went even paler, if that was possible. He told her to push it back, but she insisted the network head was already on the line. He looked at me with something approaching panic, then excused himself. As he reached the door, he turned back and asked if we could talk privately after his call. I told him I'd be here, working on my notes for the show. After he left, the remaining writers seemed to deflate. One by one, they found excuses to leave, mumbling about meetings or deadlines. The head writer lingered longest, clearing his throat several times as if preparing to speak, but ultimately said nothing. Soon I was alone in the writer's room, surrounded by whiteboards covered with their misinterpretations of my work. I walked slowly around the room, reading their notes with new eyes. Every wrong assumption, every missed theme, every whitewashed character stared back at me. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures of the boards. Evidence, though I wasn't sure yet what I'd do with it. My hands were steady now, the shock giving way to a cold determination. They'd shown me exactly who they were. Now it was my turn. I heard footsteps in the hallway and quickly pocketed my phone. The showrunner reappeared, his face grim. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, as if barricading us in, or keeping others out. He said we needed to figure out how to move forward, that the show was too important to let personal feelings interfere. The words personal feelings dripped with condescension, even now. Some habits apparently died hard. I settled back into my chair, the same one where I'd sat through weeks of humiliation, and waited for him to continue. He seemed unnerved by my silence, fidgeting with his phone and avoiding eye contact. Finally, he offered what he probably thought was an olive branch. He suggested we could start fresh, pretend the last month hadn't happened. He'd make sure the team respected my input going forward. His tone implied he was doing me a favor. I asked him to clarify what exactly we'd be pretending hadn't happened. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He stammered something about misunderstandings and getting off on the wrong foot. I pressed further, asking if he meant the time he'd called me a diversity hire, or when he'd said I was too young to understand literature, or perhaps when he'd laughed at my suggestion about the love interest's race. His face grew redder with each example. He tried to interrupt, but I continued. I mentioned the head writer patting my head, the jokes about babysitting me, the conversation at the water cooler about people like me being the real racists. My voice remained calm, almost conversational. When I finished, the silence stretched between us like a chasm. He looked older suddenly, the confident swagger replaced by something almost desperate. He started to speak several times, each attempt dying before it could form into words. I watched him struggle to form words, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Finally, he managed to speak, his voice strained and artificial. He suggested we focus on the future rather than dwelling on past misunderstandings. The word misunderstandings made my jaw clench, but I kept my expression neutral. The showrunner moved to the whiteboard, erasing my carefully photographed notes with broad, aggressive strokes. He explained that they'd been planning to take the show in a bold new direction anyway, one that would really showcase the material's potential. His back was to me, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. I asked what kind of direction he had in mind. He turned, marker in hand, and began sketching out a completely different story arc. The protagonist would now be a middle-aged white professor. The love interest would be his graduate student, and the Underground Railroad imagery would become a metaphor for academic freedom. My stomach churned as I watched him systematically destroy everything I'd created. He finished his presentation with a flourish, clearly expecting me to protest. Instead, I pulled out my notebook and began taking detailed notes. This seemed to unnerve him more than anger would have. He asked what I was writing, and I told him I was documenting his creative vision for the show. The head writer returned then, followed by the others. They'd clearly been conferring in the hallway, because they moved with coordinated purpose. The showrunner briefed them on the new direction, and they all nodded enthusiastically, praising his brilliant reinterpretation of the source material. One writer suggested they could minimize my involvement by assigning me to write character backstories that wouldn't make it into the actual scripts. Another proposed I could research historical details for authenticity, keeping me busy but irrelevant. They discussed this as if I wasn't sitting right there. I continued taking notes, my pen moving steadily across the page. The head writer noticed and asked to see what I was writing. I showed him the page, which contained a verbatim record of their conversation. His face went pale when he saw his own words about keeping me busy, but irrelevant, written in my neat handwriting. The showrunner called for a break, suggesting everyone take 15 minutes to regroup. As the others filed out, he asked me to stay behind. Once we were alone, he dropped the pretense of professionalism entirely. He told me I had two choices: play along with their vision, or find myself mysteriously unable to contribute due to creative differences. I asked him to elaborate on what playing along would entail. He outlined a scenario where I would publicly support their interpretation, attend meetings but speak only when asked, and essentially become a silent figurehead. In exchange, I'd keep my credit and paycheck. The alternative, he implied, would be much less pleasant. The studio head returned before I could respond, accompanied by the network head. They'd been discussing the show's progress and wanted an update. The showrunner immediately launched into an enthusiastic pitch about their new direction, claiming I'd been instrumental in developing these fresh ideas. I watched the studio head's face carefully as the showrunner spoke. His expression grew increasingly skeptical, especially when the showrunner claimed I'd suggested making the protagonist a middle-aged professor. When he finished, the studio head turned to me and asked for my thoughts on these changes. The room held its breath. I could feel the showrunner's eyes boring into me, willing me to play along. Instead, I opened my notebook and began reading from my notes, starting with the showrunner's suggestion that we pretend the last month hadn't happened. I read his words about keeping me busy but irrelevant, about creative differences, about becoming a silent figurehead. The network head's face darkened with each word. When I finished, he asked to see my notebook. I handed it over, watching as he flipped through pages of carefully documented conversations, dismissed ideas, and condescending comments. His jaw tightened as he read. The showrunner tried to interject, claiming I'd misunderstood or taken things out of context. The studio head silenced him with a look. He asked me what I thought should happen with the show. I took a breath and outlined my original vision, the one I'd written into the novel years ago. The other writers returned during my explanation, freezing in the doorway as they realized what was happening. I continued speaking, describing the themes they'd dismissed, the characters they'd whitewashed, the metaphors they'd misunderstood. The head writer tried to interrupt, but the network head told him to let me finish. When I concluded, the studio head asked the showrunner to explain why he'd systematically ignored the author's vision for her own work. The showrunner's response was a masterclass in deflection, blaming creative differences, claiming artistic interpretation, suggesting that authors didn't always understand their own work's potential. The showrunner just erased all her notes from the whiteboard while saying they need to look forward instead of back. That's such a strange way to handle being caught. Why would he think destroying her work right in front of her would help? The network head wasn't buying it. He asked each writer directly what they thought of my interpretations versus the showrunners. One by one, they sided with their boss, though their enthusiasm seemed forced. Only the youngest writer hesitated, glancing between me and the showrunner before mumbling his support for the new direction. The studio head thanked everyone for their input, then announced he needed to make some calls. He asked me to join him in his office in an hour. As he left with the network head, I could hear them discussing the situation in low, serious tones. The showrunner's face had gone from red to white. Once the executives were gone, the atmosphere in the room turned hostile. The showrunner accused me of sabotaging the production, of being unable to separate my ego from the creative process. The head writer added that I'd proven exactly why diversity hires were dangerous, bringing politics into everything. I gathered my things calmly, ignoring their escalating accusations. As I reached the door, the showrunner called out that I was making a huge mistake, that I'd never work in television again if I continued down this path. I paused, considering my response, then left without a word. In the hallway, I encountered the youngest writer. He approached hesitantly, glancing around to make sure we were alone. He admitted he'd actually read my book multiple times and understood exactly what I'd been trying to say in our meetings. He'd been too afraid to speak up, worried about his career. I asked why he was telling me this now. He pulled out his phone and showed me a recording. He'd been documenting the meetings too, initially for his own reference, but had captured several particularly damaging conversations. He offered to share them with me, saying someone needed to stand up to them. Back in my temporary office, I reviewed his recordings. They were worse than I'd remembered. The showrunner discussing how to minimize my involvement, the head writer suggesting they could claim any good ideas as their own, another writer joking about making me fetch coffee. My hands shook with anger as I listened. The hour passed quickly. I made my way to the studio head's office, where I found him in deep discussion with the network head and someone I didn't recognize. She introduced herself as the head of human resources. My stomach dropped as I realized the implications of her presence. They asked me to describe my experience in detail. I spoke for nearly an hour, supplementing my account with the recordings the youngest writer had shared. The HR head took copious notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. The studio head's expression grew stonier with each revelation. When I finished, they asked what outcome I wanted. I explained that I just wanted my story told correctly, with the themes and characters I'd originally created. The network head asked if I thought that was possible with the current team. I hesitated, then admitted I had doubts. The studio head made a decision. He announced they would be restructuring the writer's room, bringing in new voices who understood the material. He asked if I'd be willing to stay on in a consulting producer role, with real authority over the creative direction. I agreed, though I wondered how the showrunner would react. The meeting ended with handshakes and assurances. As I left, the HR head asked me to document everything in writing and mentioned there would be sensitivity training for the entire production. I nodded, though I doubted training would change minds that were already so firmly set. I returned to find the writer's room in chaos. Word had somehow already spread about the meeting. The showrunner was on the phone, his voice raised as he spoke to someone about contracts and creative control. The other other writers huddled together, shooting me dark looks as I entered. The showrunner ended his call and confronted me immediately. He accused me of destroying months of work, of being vindictive and unprofessional. I reminded him that I'd simply told the truth about my own book. This seemed to enrage him further, and he stepped closer, his face red with anger. The head writer intervened, pulling the showrunner back. He suggested they all take the rest of the day to process this development. As they gathered their things, I heard him mutter something about entitled millennials destroying the industry. I bit my tongue, knowing any response would only escalate things. Alone again, I surveyed the empty room. The whiteboard still showed traces of their misinterpretations, ghost images of erased notes. I picked up a marker and began writing, sketching out my original vision for the pilot episode. It felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen. The youngest writer returned as I worked. He apologized for not speaking up in the meeting, explaining his fear of being blacklisted. I told him I understood, that I'd been silent for weeks myself. He offered to help with the new outline, and together we began reconstructing my original narrative. As we worked, he shared stories about the writer's room dynamics before I'd arrived. The casual racism, the dismissive attitudes toward younger writers, the assumption that only middle-aged white men could create serious art. My experience, he said, had only been slightly worse than usual. The studio head appeared in the doorway, surveying our work. He nodded approvingly at the outlined themes and character descriptions. He informed us that the showrunner had been asked to take a few days to consider his position. The implication was clear: cooperate with the new direction or leave the project. Over the following days, the production entered a strange limbo. The showrunner technically remained in charge, but everyone knew his authority was compromised. He attended meetings stone-faced and silent, contributing only when directly asked. The other writers followed his lead, creating an atmosphere of passive resistance. I focused on developing the pilot script, working closely with the studio head to ensure my vision remained intact. We brought in consultants to address the historical elements, experts who actually understood the Underground Railroad references I'd embedded throughout. Their enthusiasm for the material reminded me why I'd written it in the first place. The head writer attempted one last power play, circulating a memo questioning my qualifications and suggesting the production was being derailed by political correctness. The memo backfired spectacularly when someone leaked it to the network executives. His position became untenable, and he quietly resigned rather than face further scrutiny. One by one, the original writers began leaving the project. Some claimed creative differences, others found sudden opportunities elsewhere. Only the youngest writer remained, grateful for the chance to work on something meaningful. The showrunner held out the longest, but eventually, he too announced his departure. The studio brought in Alina Joe as the new showrunner. She was a rising star known for her nuanced handling of complex themes. Our first meeting felt like a revelation. She'd read my book multiple times, understood every layer of meaning, and had ideas that enhanced rather than erased my vision. We spent hours discussing the characters, the themes, the visual language that would bring the story to life. She brought in a diverse team of writers who approached the material with respect and genuine understanding. The writer's room transformed from a hostile environment to a creative haven. The youngest writer, Nathan, flourished in this new atmosphere. His insights were valued, his contributions acknowledged. He told me privately that he'd learned more in a week with the new team than in months with the old guard. I watched him grow more confident with each passing day. As we developed the scripts, I discovered sabotage attempts from the departed team. They'd filed complaints with the guild, spread rumors about production troubles, even tried to poach key crew members. Alina handled each challenge with grace, never letting their pettiness derail our progress. The pilot script took shape beautifully. Sarah, my protagonist, emerged as I'd always envisioned her: complex, flawed, brilliant, and undeniably black. The Underground Railroad imagery wove through every scene, subtle but unmistakable. The love story carried the weight of history while feeling immediate and real. During a table read, I watched actors bring my words to life for the first time. The young woman playing Sarah understood her completely, finding nuances in the character that even I hadn't fully realized. When she delivered a key monologue about inherited trauma, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The network executives attended the read, and their response exceeded my hopes. They greenlit the full season on the spot, with a budget that would do justice to the story. As we celebrated, I thought about those first horrible weeks, and how close I'd come to letting them win. Alina pulled me aside during the celebration. She'd heard through industry contacts that the former showrunner was struggling to find work. His reputation for being difficult had finally caught up with him. She asked if I felt vindicated. I considered the question, realizing I felt more relief than satisfaction. Production began in earnest. The set design captured the dual reality of the story perfectly, with hidden passages and underground spaces that mirrored the characters' interior lives. Watching the physical world of my imagination take shape was surreal and deeply moving. The former writers made one final attempt to undermine the production. They gave interviews to trade publications, claiming they'd been forced out for refusing to compromise their artistic integrity. The articles painted me as a difficult author who couldn't let go of control. Alina advised me to ignore them, but the lies stung. Recording the meetings was such a smart move by that young writer. What made him decide to document everything from the start? I'm trying to understand why Alina Joe immediately got Sarah's character, when the others spent weeks missing the point entirely. Nathan surprised me by writing a powerful rebuttal, detailing his experience in both writers' rooms. Other crew members came forward with their own stories, and soon the narrative shifted. The truth about the toxic environment emerged, vindicating my actions completely. The former showrunner's career never recovered. As we wrapped the first season, I reflected on the journey. The show had become everything I'd dreamed of and more. Sarah's story resonated with audiences who'd been hungry for complex representation. The Underground Railroad themes sparked important conversations about history and its echoes in the present. Alina and I developed a strong working relationship built on mutual respect. She pushed me to dig deeper into my characters, to explore corners of the story I'd been afraid to examine. Under her guidance, I grew not just as a writer, but as a creative collaborator. The youngest writer, Nathan, had become a trusted friend and colleague. He'd found his voice in our writer's room, contributing scripts that honored the source material while bringing fresh perspectives. Watching him succeed felt like a small victory against the system that had tried to silence both of us. On the last day of filming, the entire cast and crew gathered for a wrap party. The young actress playing Sarah gave a speech about what the role meant to her, how rare it was to play a character with such depth and agency. Her words reminded me why I'd fought so hard to preserve my vision. As I watched the celebration, celebration, I noticed how different this environment was from those first terrible weeks. The room buzzed with creative energy, mutual respect, and genuine excitement about the work we'd done. We'd built something special, not just a show, but a community. The studio head found me during the party. He apologized again for the rocky start and thanked me for persevering. He mentioned that the network had implemented new policies about author involvement and diverse hiring practices. My experience had led to systematic changes that would benefit future productions. I thought about the showrunner's threat that I'd never work in television again. Instead, I'd helped create a new model for how authors could be involved in adaptations. The success of our approach had other networks reconsidering their practices. Sometimes standing your ground creates ripples beyond your own story. The next morning, I arrived at the studio to find security guards stationed outside the writer's room. The showrunner stood arguing with them, his face purple with rage as he gestured wildly at the locked door. The head of security explained that the studio had revoked his access pending an investigation into workplace conduct. I walked past him without acknowledgement, swiping my badge to enter. Inside, Alina Jo sat reviewing scripts with Nathan and two new writers she'd brought in. They looked up as I entered, and Alina gestured to an empty chair beside her. The contrast to my first day was stark. The showrunner pounded on the glass door, shouting something I couldn't hear through the soundproofing. Alina glanced at him briefly, then returned her attention to the script. She pointed out a scene that needed strengthening, asking Nathan for his thoughts. His suggestions were sharp and insightful. Over the following weeks, the production transformed completely. Alina restructured everything from casting to crew assignments. The former showrunner attempted various disruptions, showing up at production meetings uninvited, sending hostile emails to department heads, even trying to convince actors that the show would fail without him. Each attempt backfired spectacularly. The costume designer, who'd endured his micromanagement for years, publicly supported Alina's vision. The cinematographer shared stories of the showrunner's past behavior that made my experience seem mild. Department by department, the production rallied behind the new direction. I discovered the extent of the sabotage when our production coordinator found altered script pages in the system. Someone had accessed the files remotely, changing key character descriptions and dialogue. The changes were subtle, but would have fundamentally altered the story's meaning. Digital forensics traced the access to the former head writer's login. Alina handled it brilliantly. She implemented new security protocols, changed all access codes, and documented everything for the studio's legal team. The network executives were furious about the breach. They expanded their investigation to include potential criminal charges for the unauthorized access. The casting process revealed more interference. Several actors mentioned receiving calls warning them away from the project, claiming it was troubled and would damage their careers. One young actress showed me texts from the former showrunner promising her better roles if she withdrew from consideration for Sarah. We cast the show anyway, finding brilliant actors who understood the material deeply. The actress who won the role of Sarah had actually written her thesis on contemporary adaptations of historical trauma. Her audition left everyone in the room stunned. She embodied everything I'd imagined when creating the character. During pre-production, I worked closely with the department heads to ensure every visual element supported the story's themes. The production designer created underground spaces that felt both literal and metaphorical. The costume designer developed a color palette that evolved with Sarah's journey. Every detail mattered. The former writers attempted one last coordinated attack. They filed a complaint with the Writers Guild, claiming they'd been discriminated against for their artistic vision. The complaint was so poorly constructed and contradictory that it actually strengthened our position. The Guild's investigation instead uncovered a pattern of their past behavior on other productions. Nathan thrived in his new role as story editor. He caught continuity issues others missed, suggested dialogue improvements that enhanced character voices, and mentored the newer writers with patience and skill. Watching him grow into his confidence was one of the most satisfying aspects of the entire experience. Alina and I developed a shorthand that made collaboration effortless. She understood my vision while bringing her own insights that elevated the material. When she suggested exploring Sarah's relationship with her grandmother more deeply, it opened up emotional layers I hadn't fully explored in the novel. The first day of filming arrived with unexpected emotion. Standing on set, watching Sarah's world come to life exactly as I'd imagined, overwhelmed me. The actress playing Sarah approached between takes, thanking me for creating a character that reflected her own family's history. Her gratitude reminded me why representation mattered. The former showrunner made headlines when he was arrested for trespassing after repeatedly attempting to access the production offices. His mugshot circulated through industry newsletters, effectively ending any remaining credibility he had. The head writer's unauthorized access to our scripts resulted in criminal charges for computer fraud. As filming progressed, the dailies exceeded everyone's expectations. The performances were nuanced and powerful, the cinematography captured both beauty and pain, and the Underground Railroad imagery worked even better on screen than on the page. Network executives visited the set, their enthusiasm genuine and infectious. Alina implemented a writer's room culture of mutual respect and creative risk-taking. Young writers felt safe pitching bold ideas. Experienced writers mentored without condescending. The room became a space where the best idea won, regardless of who suggested it. Everything the previous room hadn't been. The production faced normal challenges like weather delays and budget constraints, but the team's collaborative spirit made solutions easier to find. When we needed to cut an expensive location, the writers reimagined the scene in a way that actually strengthened the emotional impact. Creativity flourished under supportive leadership. Nathan wrote what became the season's most powerful episode, exploring generational trauma through 3 timelines. His script wove past and present seamlessly, using the Underground Railroad imagery to connect historical and contemporary injustices. The network called it the best script they'd read all year. Post-production brought new satisfactions. The composer created a score that incorporated field recordings from actual Underground Railroad sites. The editor found rhythms that honored both the thriller elements and the deeper themes. Every department understood they were creating something meaningful. The former writers' careers continued to implode. 2 were dropped by their agencies after other clients came forward with similar stories. The showrunner's production company folded when investors withdrew support. Their attempts to paint themselves as victims of cancel culture only accelerated their professional decline. Test screenings generated extraordinary responses. Audiences connected deeply with Sarah's journey, understanding the layered metaphors while enjoying the suspenseful plot. The network ordered ordered a second season before we'd even finished post-production on the first. They also approved my proposal for a writer's training program. Alina suggested I direct an episode in season 2. The idea terrified and thrilled me equally. She arranged for me to shadow directors during the remainder of season 1, learning the technical aspects while developing my visual storytelling skills. Another door opening because someone believed in my capabilities. The wrap party felt like a celebration of more than just completing production. We'd created something that mattered while also transforming how the industry might approach adaptations. I'm trying to understand why the showrunner kept trying to get back in after being locked out. Did he really think pounding on the glass door would work? The way Alina just ignored him and kept working shows such focus. The studio head announced that our production model would become the template for future literary adaptations at the network. Industry publications covered our innovative approach to author involvement. Other networks began reaching out, wanting to understand how we'd structured the collaboration. What started as one woman defending her work had evolved into a potential industry shift. The ripple effects continued spreading. The premiere approached with building anticipation. Critics who'd seen advanced screeners praised the show's complexity and authenticity. One review particularly moved me, noting how the series honored its source material while finding new depths through the visual medium. They understood what we'd tried to achieve. On premiere night, I sat in the theater surrounded by the cast and crew who'd brought my vision to life. Alina squeezed my hand as the opening credits rolled. Nathan sat behind us, his excitement palpable. The young actress playing Sarah radiated joy and pride. As the first episode unfolded on screen, I thought about that horrible first day in the writer's room. The showrunner who'd called me a diversity hire was now unemployable. The head writer who'd patted my head faced criminal charges. The men who'd tried to erase my vision had instead erased themselves. The show succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Critics praised its nuanced exploration of historical trauma and contemporary injustice. Audiences connected with Sarah's journey and the Underground Railroad metaphors. The ratings exceeded the network's projections, ensuring multiple seasons to tell the complete story. Alina and I began developing other projects together, building a production company focused on amplifying marginalized voices. Nathan joined us as a development executive, his story instincts invaluable. We created opportunities for writers who might otherwise face the same hostility I'd experienced. The training program I'd proposed launched with 15 participants, all from backgrounds traditionally excluded from writers' rooms. Watching them learn and grow, seeing their confidence build, felt like completing a circle. They wouldn't have to fight the battles I'd faced. The room had changed. 6 months after the premiere, I received an unexpected letter. It was from a young black woman who'd watched the show with her grandmother, a civil rights activist. They'd seen their own family's story reflected in Sarah's journey. The letter reminded me why I'd written the book and why fighting for my vision had mattered. The former showrunner's name became industry shorthand for toxic behavior. Production companies added "Don't Pull" his name to their orientation materials. His legacy became a cautionary tale about the consequences of discrimination and professional misconduct. He never worked in television again. I continued writing novels while working in television, finding the mediums complemented each other. My second book explored similar themes through a different lens, and this time, I maintained creative control from the start. The industry had learned, and so had I. The show's success opened doors for other authors, particularly women and writers of color, to participate meaningfully in adaptations. Networks realized that respecting source material and its creators led to better content. What had felt like a personal battle became part of a larger transformation. Years later, teaching a masterclass on adaptation, I told the story of those first weeks in the writer's room. Young writers listened with disbelief that such behavior had been tolerated so recently. I assured them it was true, but emphasized how much had changed because people stood up. Alina, Nathan, and I built something lasting. Our production company became known for fostering inclusive environments where creativity flourished. We proved that diversity wasn't a burden but a strength. The shows we created reflected the world's complexity and beauty. The series finale aired to critical acclaim. Sarah's story concluded in a way that honored her journey while acknowledging that struggle continues. The Underground Railroad imagery culminated in a powerful statement about how history echoes through generations. We'd told the story I'd always envisioned. At the final wrap party, I looked around at the diverse crew we'd assembled. Writers, directors, actors, and craftspeople from every background, all committed to telling stories that mattered. We'd built more than a successful show. We'd built a new model for how the industry could work. The young actress who played Sarah had become a close friend. She'd gone on to produce her own projects, amplifying other voices as Alina had amplified mine. The ripples continued spreading, each success making space for others. The room kept expanding. What an awesome ride this has been. I've really loved diving into all these fascinating moments with you. Seriously, thanks for being part of it. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.